Okay, hello. Anyone who is watching this, if Robert and I decide that we're actually going to publish it. But I'm being joined today with my good friend, Robert Kuang, who I met in a mastermind group that we just completed together. And the reason why we wanted to record this video and start having these types of conversations is we both are coaches. We both work in the coaching industry, in the coaching space, but we find that the industry can lack a lot of depth in terms of not just representation, but in terms of its conversations around how power and privilege actually play in to the very types of mindset traps or belief systems that are holding us back. That obviously the coaching industry is really based on dismantling those belief patterns and moving through whatever emotional blocks we have, but sometimes we feel like it doesn't talk about the whole story. And we also just wanted to have a space where we could talk about really complex, very hot topic political issues, but in a space where at least we felt good and safe, and we know that we're in good company. And we thought, you know what, maybe if you're actually watching this recording, maybe we're brave enough to have these conversations and share them with other people. So I'm gonna throw it over to you, Robert, if you want to explain a little bit too why you felt called to have these conversations as well.
Yeah. Well, as you know, we've been sort of like gravitating towards perhaps having this conversation based on our own personal conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And look, no surprise here, as a coach, um, and as a human being, both diversity, inclusivity, dismantling power structures that no longer serve what we want to serve. And all of those things are like so important. And in coaching, just because of like how sometimes the stuff that it can bring up when we are tackling what we want, it brings up all of the conversations that's about this, but they're just like such hot button, ultimately deeply triggering potentially conversations, and no one is really the exception here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm so glad that like we can have a conversation as two human beings, because I know we both care about the work that we do and the impact that we want to have. And part of certainly what I'm thinking about in this current moment is like, what is going to be, how do we create a new impact given the time that we're in?
Mm.
So, yeah. But like these things are so messy. In some ways, I think that's why we're both like, it's going to have to be informal to pretend like it's not going to be messy.
Yeah.
Get that out of the way. There's no such thing. But I think at least the two of us, can connect. You know?
Yes. Yeah. And our hope is that through us connecting, that others are able to potentially see themselves in some of their struggles and frustrations in the topics that we talk about. And one of the things Robert and I actually were speaking on last week when we first started really riffing on this topic, and then said, okay, we're going to record something. And I've been wanting to record things on this topic for so long. And I know Robert has been thinking about it as well. And I thought a really great way to even address my resistance in talking about this would be to explain the idea that it's always comes down to that question of, but who am I to talk about this? Even though I well, identify as a queer woman, I've spoken not countless times, but I'm starting to speak more openly and honestly about my struggles with gender and gender body dysphoria and all those things, on top of also being a lesbian, being a woman, but also very aware of my whiteness, and looking at how can we actually have these types of conversations in spaces where, even if we feel like we don't quote unquote check all of the boxes that ironically give us the power to speak about certain topics, that we can still speak about them, because it really is a conversation that everyone needs to be having. It's not a conversation that's only meant for certain groups of people. And as you were saying, Robert, it can be messy and people get triggered, and it's really hard when you're having conversations like this that can become so intense so quickly, because they carry so much trauma associated with them, and someone saying something that triggers us, it just pulls us into the depths of every horrible thing that we've ever experienced seems to come to light in that moment. And so trying to just find ways, like your favorite gold chain that maybe your grandma gave you, or something, or that necklace that someone gave you and you left in your pocket too long and it's all crumpled up together, and you're just trying to delicately undo the knot one by one. That's what we're doing here, but with no real intention of saying that we know what's right or what's wrong. That's, I think, part of the conversation is there's no right, there's no wrong. It's a lot of gray, and it really comes down to your intention, and as long as it's coming from a place of compassion and empathy and understanding, holding out space that the person you're having the conversation with is coming from the same space. And therefore, even if sometimes you don't agree or we say things that upset each other, not even like you and I, Robert, but like you hear things that trigger you, it's about giving the person the benefit of the doubt and understanding that maybe that wasn't their intention, and actually trying to hear what it is that they're saying, because ultimately that's why you're being triggered at the same time, is you are feeling unseen, unheard. And sometimes in our reaction to feeling unseen and unheard, all we do is do the very thing to the other person that we are so frustrated we feel is happening to us.
Yeah. And you can't, you, this cannot change in a vacuum. So,
Nope.
in other words, these things can only happen by participation with other people in this world. So, oftentimes, I think we get, especially with the advent of like social media and all of that,
Yeah.
we are sort of connecting, and yet we are trying to figure all this out still in a vacuum. Especially if it's just like things we're going to send out into the world, our thoughts, our intentions, our words, anything like that. And that will ultimately affect the relationships where you work and all of these things. And I also want to like add to what you said, because it's like there's that belief that if you don't talk about it, you're not participating. But at the same time, it's like, but are you participating in the contents of a conversation about this stuff, right? Just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean that nothing is happening or that you are not at the effect of what we're going to talk about. Which, in the year 2020, I just can't imagine that that's something being like, oh, I have never thought about race.
Yeah.
Like, I have a feeling that's probably what we might call a defense.
Yep.
Right. And, okay, the most important, what I love about this conversation with you is that we are not the same people. We
No.
come from different backgrounds. We have different considerations, and we take up different spaces in things that's around like diversity. And personally, while it can be difficult, I've always wanted to engage in conversations with people that I don't necessarily know I already am going to agree with, because how can you create possibility? So hopefully by us just like, oh, do we curse? Can we curse?
Oh, of course. I swear all the time.
Yeah, I love that. I was just like, you know what? We can only shoot the shit. What else can you do with this stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, is like with what you're saying, it is really important for us to actually be in dialogue with people who have different experiences than us, because that's the only way that we actually find that synchronicity that we are looking for. Otherwise, all we actually do is root more into our sense of like identity. And I believe that obviously our identity is important to us, but then sometimes what ends up happening is it becomes too much of us. And in the becoming too much of us, not to get like too philosophical, it actually moves us further away from who we are. And this was something, Robert, that you even brought up last week, where you were talking about how you feel, depending on what space you're in, you have to siphon off parts of yourself, but that's perceived to be a bad thing. When you're explaining, like when you go and you're celebrating like Chinese New Year, you feel as though you have to like siphon off your gayness. And the question though is that always a bad thing? Because you are also not just a gay man. So sometimes it's like that complexity of really looking at, we root really hardcore into our identity, and we use it as a sense of pride, but sometimes are wanting to hold on to it as a cornerstone root of who we are. It traps us in and of itself, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
I mean, the word that comes up for me is like over identification,
Yeah.
which, um, yeah, I will say, I mean, I only have my own story to share here as well, where you've experienced coming out, and so have I as a queer person. And when there's so much baggage and stuff related to it, your identity that you're trying to accept, I do think like there goes through a period where that becomes like your whole world, because
Mhm.
that's literally what it takes to like integrate a part of us that we've denied. So I guess part of my argument is that that could be part of the process,
Mm.
but what then happens is like, yeah, I go to Chinese New Year and I'm still processing my queer identity or my gayness or whatever you call it. And it's just, sometimes we're just protecting ourselves. We don't, it's like, oh, I recognize like one survival mechanism might come up at Chinese New Year. But gosh, sometimes when things get intersectional, you might have like four.
Yeah.
And that's just like where the rubber meets the road. That there's a certain point where, discussion, or as we like to call it, discourse, is just like it's not gonna it's not gonna take away the discomfort of the experience, unfortunately. Yeah. Did you hear the last part?
Mm. Yes. Yeah. And I think, okay, I think we should also, Robert and I know what certain terms mean, but I want to make sure that people who are watching this who maybe don't know what, as an example, intersectionality is, because I know I have had a lot of people even get me to explain what that means to them because they don't know. And so I'll give my take on what it means, and then Robert, you can give your take on what it means.
Oh,
But because it's like, for me, intersectionality is, it's, if you think of it as an intersection, it's where all of these different identities or experiences that you have meet to make up the cornerstone or the outline of essentially who you are, because we are a sum of our experiences. So intersectionality would be looking at things like what I was describing earlier. I'm white, I'm queer, like I don't always identify with my gender. Um, I have a learning disability. I come from a like middle class family, but in my family, I'm the first person to pursue secondary education. So it's like looking at all of those experiences make up the sum of who I am, and they intersect differently. And so a lot of it is, even with what Robert and I were talking about, we can, like, we aren't just one identity. So even if you're like a straight white man, that's still you actually intersecting on three different platforms. And in those three different platforms of being a straight white man, you can still have all these other complexities. Like, you grew up in poverty. You also could be the first person to pursue secondary education. You could have a physical ailment or disability. So it's really looking at the reality that our personalities are so much more complex because our experiences are so complex. And so intersectionality is essentially where those things meet in us as an individual.
yes, absolutely. And intersectionality, it's just kudos to Crenshaw, I'm just going to say.
Yeah.
Kimberly Crenshaw, in case you guys should look up her name and her work and her legacy. But yeah, intersectionality to me is understanding that each of our identities, the way that we label ourselves and identify, are like one of the lenses that we have. And each of these is like a different lens. But for me, I interpret that as like one lens has a different set of power dynamics and social norms and cultural like opinions behind it. So like for myself, we're all intersectional in some way, I would say, because our intersectionalities are me being a cisgender male, me being a queer person, me being a person of color, but specifically Chinese American, being Asian, being a coach, being a writer, these are all different lenses. And it just so happens that you might have multiple lenses come into a situation, but they all have slightly different power dynamics associated. So intersectionality is like basically not to be too, well, in my words, not to be too black and white about everything, because you could be a person of color and you could be rich, for example. And intersectionality calls upon us to have that some sort of nuance about where a person can find success and struggle, for example, or happiness and sadness, any of these things. So that's sort of how I look at it. And for me personally, it's just one of those things to think about and to keep thinking about, and you're never going to get it right, but it can also help you unpack why certain things may not make sense when it's all black and white.
That was a really great, I loved the analogy you used with the lenses and the perspective, because ultimately too, Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in, I think it's his book Strangers, or something about strangers.
Right.
But he essentially talks about how ultimately the reason we never can truly understand a stranger is for that very reason. At the end of the day, our experiences, our lenses are so vastly different than others that if we don't take the time to recognize that something that someone can be sharing with us, even though that's not our reality, it's still their reality. And this is the issue I feel like a lot of people get into when we talk about like any type of power and oppression, and any form of power and oppression. So not like the three obviously main hot ones are race, sexuality, and gender. But under obviously those categories, there's so many other categories. And the reason I find in my experience, even in analyzing and going through my own forms of internalized sexism and homophobia, and then obviously racism as a whole, especially as a white person, the lenses piece is, it's really recognizing that we just make the assumption that how we've experienced the world is how others experience the world. And so then we hold others to the same standards. So if we overcame a situation, we expect falsely that everyone else can overcome the exact same situation because they have the same makeup, tools, resources that we've had. And that's where the judgment pieces come in. And then sometimes it's also the piece of, I also, like I'm saying this for me personally, but I also have experienced this in my experiences and conversations with others, is sometimes we are afraid to acknowledge that someone else maybe struggled more than us, because we feel that acknowledging their pain and suffering takes away from our accomplishments, because somehow it means that it was easier for us. And that in and of itself adds this other intersectional thing where if we feel like, well, we've come from a place of struggle, being told that our struggle is less than someone else's, it creates this other power dynamic, which is again where we get triggered, where we shut down, where we don't want to be open to hearing other people's experiences, because it just becomes always this weird game of protecting our ego, either because we feel that you're telling us that we're less than because of your racism, sexism, homophobia towards us, like the things that you're saying, or any type of oppression towards us, or we feel like you're telling us that we're less than because we didn't experience those things, and therefore our triumphs aren't as triumphant because we haven't struggled as greatly and it was just easier for us and we were handed our success. And so it just is like this clusterfuck on all sides, which is
Yeah,
why I'm excited to talk about it.
that's why I think, the lens is like, yeah, in one lens, one person may have gotten a lot of fulfillment, success, whatever. I mean, whatever, however you define like what you're working towards in life. But that's just one lens of that person. And another person is looking through perhaps another very specific and singular lens, like their age. And maybe that person is feeling just extremely bothered because of this very specific lens. And then like the two collide, we're trying to make meaning out of something without all the other lenses that gives nuance and complexity to the person. So sure, like our moments of achievement or just, ultimately getting the things that we want out of life are really momentous and memorable, and we'll probably keep talking about it, you know, but like, but that's just, at the end of the day, that's just one lens. And in some ways, I think, you know, for between the two of us, we're also both very spiritually minded people. Like, to me, that's very deeply linked to our humanity too. It's just like,
Yes.
yeah, there's no such thing as one lens. But but you know, it is tough, because then you're like, okay, well, how do I even like behave in the world then? What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Which I sort of get to, but you know, yeah. But I'm curious now, like so before you got into coaching, what your degree was in gender studies,
And
right?
religion,
Religion.
which I is again everything in hindsight, right? Now I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, all of that makes sense. At the time, I just like knew I was supposed to be doing it, but when everyone asked me what I was going to do for work, I couldn't explain it. And now I laugh and I say, the joke's on you suckers.
I remember the very first conversation we had. I was like, oh man, now I'm super curious, like how your education and like the things that you were curious about came into coaching and things. And it's like, of course, when people come to us, when clients and just like friends or people in our lives come to us, this stuff comes up all the time, even if we're sort of essentially talking around it. It can still come up, you know? And I think there's a danger to leaving things unspoken because it just like festers. And that's another thing, which I personally think like healthy dialogue or civil dialogue is really key, because when you're working through something that's so tender and emotionally charged, it can, leaving it kind of pent up will just, you know, ultimately I think lead to a lot of bad or potentially really mutually harmful uh, outcomes, you know? Yeah. But yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. I'm trying really, I'm working on this whole thing where I don't interrupt people. So I'm still trying to get better at it. So being like, just wait until you know for sure that they're done and then you can speak. I'm an interrupter. Uh, but no, I think too, it's interesting with what it is that you're saying. Um, because I think part of the idea is that this is so complex and it's so murky and there isn't like a right or wrong. A lot of it is just gray. And that's the part where it can be so challenging for people because they root into the fact that they want to be a good person. Again, that's another lens. I'm a good person. And I know you and I have spoken about this, and I've spoken about this like in other arenas too, that where sometimes our desire to be a good person is the very thing that makes us a bad person because it closes us off to any argument that could counter our sense of self. So I'm a good person translates into I'm not racist, I'm not homophobic, I'm not sexist. And so sometimes what I can do, especially like as a white person, I can be in situations where someone might say like, oh, that was off base, Lana, or even I question if what I just said was off base or not. And it can be a struggle because I want to hold on to my sense of identity, which is that I'm a good person, and a good person doesn't do those types of things. So then I can kind of justify my actions around why I said this or why I did that, which the ironic thing is that's the thing that's making me a bad person. Not even if what I said was off base or not, but the very act of not giving space to hear somebody else and hear what it is that they have to say and instead feel like I need to defend my sense of identity. That's the issue. But that comes out on both sides of the spectrum. So that also comes out on the other side when sometimes I feel the need to attack someone because I feel that what they've said is off base. My need to attack sometimes isn't actually rooted in a good quality of wanting to support them in educating them around how they could do it differently next time, which would be soft and compassionate and kind and understanding. And instead, it's an attack. And the attack part is, I want to feel superior to you. So I'm going to correct your wrong right now. And because I'm of the demographic that can correct you on this topic and you are not, you have to listen to everything that I'm saying to you right now and take it as truth, which is again the really complicated murkiness because am I actually right? And what I'm saying in that moment is not necessarily coming from a place of compassion. It's coming from a place of wanting to feel better than. And so it just becomes like this really, it's so complicated. And I think that's why it's important for us to discuss as well, because I do think that sometimes this desire we have to be a good person traps us into doing bad things. And yeah, what is your take on that thought?
Oh, that's so funny. So the first thought that came up was like, I see your religion studies coming in maybe a little bit. Because like the good and bad is so interesting because it's like it you're right, I agree with you. It's like when you declare that I'm a good person, sometimes it's like what's underneath there is like I'm a good person because I reject this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And yet, when we take that stance, it's like, oh, I'm a good person because I don't watch violent movies, right? So, but what is what is the inflection there? It's like, oh, people who watch like violent movies are bad, therefore, because I'm a good person, and this is my definition of the things that good people don't do. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such a locked lens, by the way. That's so seductive because it's such a locked lens because it's like, well, I'm a good person, but that can lead to a lack of examination, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll talk about it from the other side, which is something that I brought up just yesterday, which is sometimes people get into sometimes people have the desire to get into service or to be of service, and specifically to find those who are suffering more than them to punish themselves as if they're not inherently good people.
Mm.
Does that make any sense?
Yes, but I understand because I'm in the coaching industry. So elaborate.
Oh, interesting.
Because like I see people play out that pattern of sometimes the idea is like I can't be saved, so I'm going to save you instead.
Right. I mean, I think I have a feeling we probably have both come up, and perhaps yours truly has come up. But seriously, so okay, I just very directly, I shared with you my breakthrough recently.
Mm-hmm.
And the breakthrough was that one of my underlying beliefs in the way I make decisions around like resources and things like money, but like basically everything, people, resources, money, things like that. I had unconsciously identified all of like any and all possible resources available to me as a form of privilege.
Mm.
Because privilege is probably one of the most shame inducing words. Brene Brown like has talked about it, where it's just like, first of all, it's like very easy to like look at every lens and be like, one person has some form of comfort that is desirable by someone who doesn't have that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like, it's so shame inducing to talk about things like that. And guess who got caught up in that? So that's something I had to like, well, the truth is I'm still processing that, but what that does, it creates new possibility for me. And also I can still be at service.
Mm-hmm.
But to identify anything good in our life as something that's just bestowed upon us is essentially a declaration that life only happens to us. But
Mm.
being of service, I think, is active, it's intentional, and it's very purpose driven. And a lot of that stuff is going to require conversations like this, which, I mean, how many times have you been in conversations like this where it just goes nowhere? And it's a little bit like emotionally exhausting, and you're like, what do we come to? So ideally, hopefully, it comes to like us being able to get more of what we want out of life, but does it always happen? No. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think and sometimes it's because we don't know what we want out of life. So we're we're chasing a we're trying to answer a question without ever maybe examining that we're asking the wrong question to begin with, trying to find the wrong answers. But I think with what you were saying with Brene Brown, and it's true, privilege, like when someone says, check your privilege, it feels like the sucker punch to the gut. Uh, and it's this thing where it's funny because when I think the concept of like understanding our privilege is immensely powerful, because we do have to understand where our experience and someone else's experience do not line up, and therefore that can dictate the current circumstance that we are in. But it's one of those things where I have a hard time, and I'm saying this coming from a place of like I have I have definitely said check your privilege before, um and I'm like not happy to admit it. And you know what the ironic thing is I said it to I okay in a I'm just gonna tell the whole story. Because in a spiritual sense, like I think that my relationship with my father is my greatest, like I think he's one of my greatest spiritual teachers. He's a very unspiritual religious person, but I think that hands down he's been one of my greatest teachers, and he's the person that I said it to. And I said it to him in we were debating, as we do. But the ironic thing is that in me demanding that he check his privilege, I was not checking my own. And so the reality of the situation is that I can sum up my father into the three lenses we were talking about earlier: white, straight, and a man. But when I do that, what I really fail to acknowledge is that he's still a human who has all of these experiences outside of mine. And when I actually look at his life in a timeline view, I have things are doing a funny thing. I've had immense more privilege in my life because of the struggles that so here I am telling someone to check their privilege when I'm the one that should have been in that moment checking mine. But because I have the check boxes, like the queer woman checkbox, I actually hold the power in being able to say that. And it's almost like a trump card. You feel like you can't come back from it. And for me, this has been my relationship with my dad has been really a focal point in me exploring how this is such a complex issue, because like his upbringing was fucking shit. And he has overcome way more struggles than I have. Yes, like he can do certain things without having to worry the ways that I have to. But if we were to actually do like a solid play by play, he's coming out on the more like has adversity standpoint than I have, but society deems me to have less privilege than him. And so I think it's like this thing sometimes, this lens we have to look at around when we say things like check your privilege or understand your privilege. Part of it is also just recognize, again, it's just so complex. And I've like certain privileges that he has outside of the three classics are all privileges he actually had to work really hard to earn. And that's another component of privilege we don't always address, is there are privilege, but some of it's earned. So if you, like in my family, I'm the first person to have secondary education. So having secondary education is a privilege, but it's also an earned privilege because you still have to do the work. And I don't come from a family or background that is academics, and I have a learning disability. So sometimes it's like the struggle with, if someone says, oh, well, that's a privilege that you got to go to university, it can feel like it's vastly undermining the struggle that it took for me to even get there and to get my degree. And so again, it's never so, like, and I find I don't want to use the terms black and white, but I'm always like, I don't really it's just not so like yes and no obvious, like good or bad. And that's the thing with when we look at power and oppression and things like privilege and the shame that certain things can entail, and I think that's why it really does come back to, in that moment as an example, when I was saying check your privilege, and I actually should have been the one checking mine, is it's acknowledging I was saying it not from a place of compassion, not from a place of like, I want to hold space for you so that we can have a conversation of shared enlightenment. I was using it as a trump card to feel better about myself. And that is actually the thing that makes it wrong. even though the topic was seemingly righteous because I was defending the less privileged in our conversation. Because my dad has more like right-leaning politics. But so it's just, you're just like, I'm actually sometimes the problem, which is, I think the idea is a lot of the times we're the problem, even when we don't want to be.
And that's why it's so delicate, because like you said, the way you approach the conversation, maybe if you approach it in a different way, maybe things could have gone differently, but that's still in the end, like, part of our belief system. And that's why these conversations are so tricky, because it's like, well, then how do you take action? How do you organize? How do you change the contents of what we talk about? And that is, I personally can't think of a right answer, though perhaps there might be things that I would disagree with, but essentially what comes up is like, I can't define what is right and wrong in this, at least, even if I have opinions about it, and sometimes very strong opinions. The outcome just shows that these things are complicated.
Yes.
Otherwise we would have figured this out by now. So
yeah.
That's so tricky. And, since you shared a little bit about your father, so for example, my father is Caucasian, Jewish American. And he's my father. I call him my father. He's my stepfather, but he is the father of my life, And it's very tricky sometimes for us to have discussions around identity, because truthfully, it almost feels like it starts to feel like we're discussing how we're not a family because of our different identities that are so overt and so obvious. It's something we kind of almost have to like resist. It's like we don't look like a family, so it's like us against the world, but we're not the same people. We have different beliefs, and that's just what it is, And it's been such a journey to practice having these conversations, knowing that we are simply very different people. And there's still a possibility of creating love and support within that dynamic, And I guess another thing that's come up, like, for example, we may have had more disagreements in the year 2016, for example. But one thing that I have to remind myself is like, none of this is finished, Like we're still in relation, like me and my father still have a relationship because we're both still here. So sometimes I have to remind myself that like, okay, there's still possibility left to be mined here. And these formative moments and experiences in our lives where we try to connect about this stuff is something that can still change later on. And certainly I would say that's coming from like my spiritual backbone. But I also think like if one wants to have a life and work inside navigating these spaces, to have something to sustain yourself, because these are truly, it can get very just so emotionally charged, and also just a little bit like draining at times if we're not intentional about how we're having the discussion. So that's tough. Like I get into that all the time. My company, I've been in discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's so fascinating, because I'm like, okay, how do we make a difference when we already have this intention? And yet going through the conversations in a group, facilitating stuff about that it's so tough, And there are days where you don't go anywhere.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, that's like my thoughts about that. But it's truly, even talking about it now, it's like I can feel my mind racing. You know what I mean? Like, stuff is
yes.
I don't know what it's like for you talking about this stuff, but it's like that's where I am.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I could talk about this stuff all the time, all day. It's because it's just so, I think it's so interesting. Um, but I know, like, even as like with what you were saying earlier, where sometimes you just get so mad, frustrated, and you don't know what to do. Uh, and that's what it like is, yeah, right? Like, even when I said to my dad, like, you need to check your privilege, that's what it was. It was his anger was triggering me and I was getting angry. And then it just becomes like a war. Like, it's like fighting fire with fire. And for me, that was like a pinnacle point in me kind of realizing, like, oh, we always have the same conversations and they don't go anywhere. Maybe the dialogue has to change. And so for me, I know, like, I don't think that this is like the answer. This has just been the answer for me, is like being really intentional when I have these types of conversations to come from a place of as much compassion and understanding as humanly possible, even when I'm feeling deeply triggered and like want to attack. Because and different people, when they feel triggered, feel differently. So my default defense is like anger, rage. Like, I'm not going to like cry. Well, I might cry while being super angry, but I'm, like, different people respond differently. Some people shut down. And for me, I get very defensive and I want to attack you to the literal death. And recognizing that, although feels easy and is like my default setting, doesn't serve the purpose. Again, it moves me further away from the thing that I want, which is to feel understood, which is to feel that my perspective and my reality has meaning in the face of a person who I feel like potentially is shutting down my experiences because they don't match theirs. And that's like the dynamic that comes into play in these discussions. But the ironic thing is that by me getting angry again, I'm only doing the same thing to whoever I'm having the conversation with. In this situation, it was my father. And so being really intentional in the compassion piece of actually taking the time now to really understand the other person's perspective, even if I don't, and recognizing that understanding and holding space for their perspective doesn't mean that you agree with it. It doesn't mean that you are say, oh yeah, I'm going to throw out my beliefs. It just means I'm going to give you space to hear what it is that you feel you need to share with me, because ultimately that's actually what I want from you as well. I want to feel like I have space to be seen and to have my thoughts and feelings be valid. And I recognize that the way I go about wanting to feel valid and seen and appreciated actually deters people from being able to do that for me, because I'm making the situation hostile. And sometimes they're making the situation hostile. So it's not just me, but ultimately you don't diffuse a hostile situation by being hostile yourself, right? You diffuse the hostile situation by bringing it back to, okay, like, what is the point behind what we're talking about? What do you need from me? What can I hear from you? And I think that that's sometimes the actual missing piece around power and oppression. And I've taken my cue from a lot of like women of color who have done a lot of work in this space, like who we both love, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. And then I think her name is, oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking on her name because I'm so bad at it, but she wrote the book, Don't Label Me and Why We Need to Reform Islam. And I think that both of those women do a really great job of explaining why it doesn't matter where you feel you fall on the righteousness path of creating equality in this world. We still always have to give space for our quote unquote enemy to be heard. And we make the assumption that they should hear us out first because they have more privilege than we do, or whatever the situation is. When sometimes we just have to like swallow our pride and say, like, I'm going to give you the thing that I want you to give me. And what I have found in my conversations with my dad is like, well, they're so different now. Like, we love debating, but they're so different. Like, he actually hears me and he tells me that he thinks about the things that I've said to him, and that not always, but sometimes they change his opinion. And same with me. I tell him, like, I actually think about the things that you tell me. And sometimes, not always, you might change my opinion, because ultimately we're just like, otherwise we're just like two people in an echo chamber. We're not two people in dialogue. So it's like,
Yeah.
sometimes the best recipe is just checking our ego. Everyone checking their ego, not just because the idea is we all think that we're right.
Yeah. Also, it's like if you get triggered, probably have to have a conversation with your ego.
Yeah.
Like the requirement for that is like being alive. So
Yeah.
yeah, if you are alive in this world today, you definitely have an ego, and there are definitely things that will disrupt your spirit, basically. And
Hmm.
like some of what you talk about makes me think about, I know you've heard this, but it's like power over versus power with, you know.
Mm.
And sometimes in conversations when people say like check your privilege, I do hear it's a little bit of like you're not as powerful as you think.
Hmm.
And then there's also a little bit of like I'm the one who should be in power. So
Hmm.
that is one way to that's one possible interpretation in my heart, and that's power over. And when we see things like that, generally people know the conversation is not going to go anywhere.
Hmm.
It is just mostly for like a proclamation, and that's fine. But in order to make concrete change and to organize and to create policies or to gather and all of that, I think those kind of language is not going to help people power together. It ends up being about, okay, who's in power and who wants to topple the ones in power. And truthfully, we all know that not all people of color, not all people in the LGBTQ plus community agree about the reasons and the intentions behind why we have these discussions. Again, that's also why this discussion is important within every possible intersecting sphere. You know, Chinese people and Chinese people need to be having conversations about certain things when it comes to race or
Hmm.
class and things like that. And that's just something that, in my heart, I feel that power with and power together is a greater possibility and not making things more cyclical.
Hmm.
But yeah, so much of that is like the conversation it can, yeah. And it is so funny because a lot of the underlying mechanisms for why these things are so tough, yeah, we look at that in coaching because at the end of the day, we're in the business of getting people what they want out of life.
Hmm.
Guess what gets in the way? Lots and lots of interesting things. Such
Yeah. Yep.
a
Yeah.
the thing I had to have a breakthrough about.
Yeah. Yeah. I think too, I love what you said about power with versus power over. And I think ultimately it's like only we have to be really, really honest with ourselves, but only we can actually say what is the intention behind what it is that we're doing, because it's so true. Sometimes it feels more like certain groups of people just want to replace the current power structure with the exact same power structure, just in someone else's hands. Um, and I understand why. I understand like that feeling of being like, it's my time now or it's our time now. And like, I'm saying this coming from also the experience of gender studies. Oh my gosh. Sometimes I would be like, sometimes I'm like, oh, the stereotypes are so true. And I was so scared of people, and I'm being genuine. Like, I was scared of people in my classes. I was scared. This is me. Like I love sharing my opinion. I'm very like have conviction in what I say. I love debating. And I would be in classes sometimes with people. This was like obviously like 10 years ago or longer. But I'd be afraid to say something because I knew it didn't matter what I said, I was going to get ripped apart. And that in and of itself is another power dynamic. Like sometimes we just need to recognize that, yeah, making people afraid to have certain conversations or to ask certain questions is isn't actually what we want, like if we do really want this space of equality and people having free will to do things, it also just means being okay with the fact that like we're not always going to agree with people, and that's okay. It isn't actually about trying to get people to believe what we believe, which took me a really long time to swallow, because I definitely was I'm the righteous person and you believe what I believe and every way else is wrong. it's just recognizing, like, be okay with what you believe, but also hold space for people who aren't going to believe what you believe. It really hurt people. It's like the line, you don't actually, if I'm trying to force you to agree with everything that I believe, does that not in the end actually make me the very thing that I'm fighting against?
Yeah. Oof. I felt that one. But yeah, some, I guess the thought that comes up as I know we are going to wrap up a little bit here
Mm-hmm.
is
I could
that
talk to you forever.
I know this went by really fast. But for me, when you were describing that, what comes up for me is like things like there are like two things I have found so far that brings out more of who you are: money and psychedelics, actually.
Yep.
So like one of those things where like sometimes it's that power dynamic thing. Sometimes people, the second they get power or whatever that is, such as like money, it will immediately bring up
Mm-hmm.
everything that actually motivates them to talk about certain things, regardless of where they're coming from. So it's one of those things where I think people often find it surprising that what's intrinsically or unconsciously perhaps like motivating them about their perception of money or anything else is will be disrupted once you're in a system where now you have to figure out what to do with the power that you may have in whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I think so going back to like the kind of like against like with us or against us kind of thing, I think that's so seductive because at the end of the day I think it's so easy to just repeat the same patterns without examining the intentions behind it, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and also like where do you okay, now that this has happened, where do you want to go from here, right? It's
Yeah.
like it doesn't end just because you've arrived at wherever it is you wanted to get to. So as part of the human evolution, I do hope that we continue to be able to unpack some of these conversations, especially
Yeah.
at the time that we're in, because it's like it's not going to get anywhere or go away if we don't acknowledge it. So here
Yeah.
we are.
Yes, here we are. And I think, yeah, all the things you just said are a great place for us to end on. And knowing that we're going to have more conversations like this. And I think that the idea is you're supposed to go into conversations like this coming out honestly with more questions than answers. I think and that's actually something that Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams really hit home for me, is that idea that in her book, Radical Dharma, which I suggest everyone read, she says like the book is going to actually pose more questions than it will give you answers, but that's part of the unraveling piece. Is there, at the end of the day, there really isn't actually a solid answer. There isn't a right or wrong. It's just about following the path of curiosity and recognizing that with every answer you get more questions, but that's actually the empowering piece, because they become better questions, and the better quality questions you ask, the better answers you receive. And the problem is a lot of us don't even know what the right questions are, and that's why we get stuck circling the drain essentially and moving nowhere. So thank you so much, Robert, for having this conversation with me. uh, yeah, and we're gonna have more, so everyone please stay tuned. And I'll drop Robert's information and stuff as well in the comment section so that people can have access to it if you want to chat with him, because he's so awesome. But keep being awesome, everyone. Robert, you keep being awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for gathering us here today.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you to everyone who took the time to listen and be a part of this experience with us.